December 1976, New York City. A Vietnam veteran steps out into the freezing night for nothing more than a simple haircut. He never makes it home. No calls, no sightings. It's as if he simply vanished. For decades, the city forgets his name. The case collects dust, his body never identified. But 45 years later, a shocking twist. Police knock on the door of a retired barber. And suddenly, a long-buried secret threatens to shatter everything we thought we knew. Tonight, we unravel a mystery that took nearly half a century to surface. A mystery that asks, how well do you really know the people around you? It was a Friday, cold and gray over Queens. George Clarence Seitz began his morning as he always did, coffee in hand, the newspaper folded neatly on the table. That image tells you something about him. Order, routine, a man who preferred small certainties over chaos. A quiet life, measured and predictable. Neighbors would later recall seeing him that day. His shoes were polished, his coat buttoned, his steps deliberate. George moved through the neighborhood like a man in sync with the rhythm of the streets. There's comfort in watching someone so predictable. And yet, there's a fragility too. Life can change in a heartbeat, even for those who seem grounded. That afternoon, he left for something ordinary, a haircut. The same barbershop he had visited countless times. The familiar hum of clippers, the faint scent of aftershave, the worn leather chair that had cradled him so many mornings before. He may have nodded to someone on the street or kept his eyes down. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he walked through that door, and from that moment, he would never be seen alive again. He didn't return that evening. Perhaps at first, it didn't alarm anyone. People can be late. But George was a man of routine. His absence stretched hours into days, and the worry began to seep into the neighborhood. Calls went unanswered, questions left hanging. The ordinary had shifted into something unexplainable. And here's what strikes me about that day. The last thing he did, the gesture that would mark the beginning of a decades-long mystery, was so unremarkable. A haircut. That mundane act became the threshold into darkness. It's the quiet, banal moments that sometimes carry the heaviest weight. Now, let me explain what happened next. Decades had passed since that cold December day in 1976. For George's family, the absence became a constant presence, a quiet ache that refused to fade. The police had investigated, but leads went nowhere. Calls were made, interviews conducted, doors knocked on, but the trail had long gone cold. And yet, life has a way of hiding truths until the moment they can no longer be ignored. In 2019, a shocking discovery changed everything. Remains were found mutilated, carefully concealed beneath a backyard in Richmond Hill. The sheer horror of it is difficult to grasp. Whoever did this had gone to great lengths to hide the evidence, to erase the life of a man who had once walked these same streets, greeted the same neighbors, carried out the same ordinary rituals. It was a chilling reminder that human cruelty can lurk just beneath the surface of familiarity. Investigators examined the remains meticulously, yet identification was impossible at first. Bones told a story, yes, but a fragmented one. The passage of more than 40 years had blurred the details that might have confirmed identity. Teeth, clothing, even fingerprints, all had been degraded or destroyed. For the authorities, it was a case of knowing a crime had been committed, but not yet knowing for whom or why. Meanwhile, the family endured the worst kind of limbo. For them, the discovery offered no relief, only more questions. The skeletal evidence confirmed what they had long feared, that George was gone, and violently so, but it provided no answers about who was responsible. Nights were filled with sleepless wonderings. What had happened to him? Where had he been taken? Why had no one seen, heard, or stopped it? And yet, there is something almost surreal in the way time reshapes tragedy. The streets where George had walked, the barbershop he had frequented, The neighborhood that had been his world all continued on, oblivious. The discovery of the remains felt like a ghostly echo, a moment where past and present collided with an unrelenting weight. It is strange, isn't it, how a life can vanish from view, leaving only traces that might never tell the full story? And in this case, those traces were grim. The body bore evidence of violence, evidence of someone's deliberate attempt to erase a man's existence. But the story of George's life, his quiet routines, his small gestures of humanity, remained untouched in memory. Those who knew him still remembered the man, even if the law and the world had forgotten. The case for the authorities was eventually classified as unsolved. The file was closed, notes collected, leads marked as dead ends. For the family, each passing year without progress was another weight on their hearts, a reminder that justice could be delayed indefinitely. And yet, even in the silence of decades, hope sometimes lingers, a quiet, fragile thread that refuses to be extinguished, even when the world seems determined to forget. Now, let me explain what happened over the next 40 years. The case, like so many others that defy immediate resolution, slowly became a cold case. Files were gathered, labeled, and eventually placed on shelves in musty archives, where they would remain largely untouched. Names, dates, and fragments of evidence sat frozen in time, reminders of a crime that refused to fade from memory, but had slipped from the world's attention. For George's family, the absence was relentless. Each holiday, each birthday, each ordinary day carried a quiet, unspoken void. The phone never rang with answers. The streets of Queens continued their daily rhythm, oblivious to the hole left in one family's life. Friends, neighbors, anyone who had known George shared in a kind of collective unease, a recognition that someone had been taken. That life had continued around his disappearance as if nothing had happened. And isn't it strange, the weight of waiting? How does a family live when the world refuses to provide closure? Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually decades. The mind begins to conjure possibilities, each one heavier than the last. Did he leave voluntarily? Was he hurt? Was justice even possible after so much time? The absence of answers becomes a presence in itself, a constant companion to grief. Community memory, too, carries scars from cases like this. People who once walked the same streets as George remember the quiet man, the predictable routines, the gentle nods exchanged in passing. They carry a mix of sorrow and unease regret that the man they knew could vanish so completely, and unease that the streets they call home could hold such hidden violence. Through all of this, the case remained dormant, but never truly forgotten. There is a peculiar tension in a cold case. The crime is old, the leads have gone cold, yet the story hangs in the air, a silent witness to the passage of time. 40 years of silence do not erase the human cost. They amplify it. And so, we arrive at a moment where history and memory intersect. 40 years of unanswered questions, of grief that refuses to fade, of community whispers that keep the story alive. One can't help but wonder, what does it do to a family, to a neighborhood, to live under the shadow of a crime that has no resolution? The weight of that silence is almost tangible, pressing against the walls of everyday life, reminding everyone that some mysteries refuse to stay buried. Now, let me explain how the investigation shifted from discovery to suspicion. With George Seitz finally identified, the authorities turned their attention to those who had been part of his world, tracing the connections that might explain how a man could vanish so completely. And that's when one name began to surface: Marty Mata, the local barber. Mata had been a fixture in the neighborhood for years. On the surface, he seemed ordinary enough. A man running a small business, a shop that smelled of aftershave and hair clippings, a presence as familiar as the streets themselves. But beneath that veneer, there were whispers, hints of a more complicated past. Some remembered him as quiet, helpful, even unassuming. Others spoke of bursts of anger, of tension that seemed to ripple just beneath the surface, never fully explained. It is curious, isn't it, how people can carry multiple faces. The same man could be a friendly neighbor in one story and a source of fear in another. That duality becomes more striking as the investigation deepens. Investigators began piecing together reports, old complaints, and scattered memories. Mata's life, once unremarkable to the outside eye, started to reveal cracked small clues that pointed to behaviors inconsistent with the simple barber he presented himself to be. Neighbors gave mixed testimonies. Some said he was a man like any other, someone you might nod to in passing and forget by the next day. Others, however, recalled moments that unsettled them, flashes of temper, arguments that escalated beyond words, hints of an edge they could not place. These contrasting portraits created a puzzle, a picture of a man both familiar and opaque, ordinary and yet capable of darkness. And as the authorities listened, compiled, and verified, the focus began to sharpen. The narrative of George's disappearance, once a silent void, started to gain context. A suspect emerged, not in the form of a headline or a dramatic confrontation, but through years of patient investigation, careful questioning, and the slow unearthing of memories long buried. It makes you think about how easily the ordinary can mask something sinister. How the man next door, the one who cuts your hair, might carry secrets that would shock a community decades later. It is a chilling reminder of the layers in human behavior, of the faces we see and the ones we do not. Now, let me explain how silence finally cracked open after 4.5 decades. It was a gray morning in Queens, November 2021. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that hides decades of stories. At a modest house, police officers arrived, their presence calm but decisive. Inside lived a man few would have imagined as the centerpiece of one of New York's oldest cold cases. His name was Marty Mata. He was 74 now, his hair thinned and gray, his body slowed by age. To most neighbors, he was simply an old man who blended into the background of the community. But on this morning, detectives came for him not as a neighbor, not as a harmless retiree, but as a suspect in the brutal killing of George Seitz, a murder buried in dust since 1976. The scene was almost cinematic. The door opened, voices echoed, and the frail-looking man was led out in handcuffs. For people watching from their windows, it was a shock they struggled to process. Could it really be him, the barber they had once known? The man who cut hair, told stories, exchanged pleasantries? Was it possible that this quiet, elderly figure had lived all these years with blood on his conscience? Some neighbors whispered in disbelief, shaking their heads. Others muttered that perhaps, deep down, something had always felt off about him. But no one had ever dared to imagine this ending. After all, nearly half a century had passed. Mata had grown old among them, carrying his secret into every ordinary day. To see him now, escorted by police, was like watching time itself split open. The arrest spread across headlines within hours. Newspapers and TV anchors seized on the contrast. A crime from 1976 finally colliding with the present. Cameras captured the images of the stooped man being taken away, his wrists bound by steel, his face unreadable. The words appeared everywhere. Cold case solved. Queens barber arrested in 45-year-old murder. The irony was chilling. George Seitz had been 81 years old when his life was violently ended. And now, 45 years later, the man accused of killing him was nearly the same age. Justice had taken so long that both victim and suspect belonged to the same generation of the elderly. It raised a haunting question. Does justice delayed lose its weight, or does it grow heavier with each passing year? For the community, the moment was a rupture. Some remembered Marty as just a man trying to live quietly. Others recalled flashes of temper, unsettling stories, rumors that never made it past whispers. To them, his arrest wasn't just shocking, it was clarifying. The unease they couldn't put into words for decades finally had a shape. And beyond the neighborhood, the city felt it too. Reporters described it as the closing of a ghost story, a wound that had stayed open for nearly half a century. The image of Mata in custody became symbolic. The past never really disappears. It only waits for the right moment to resurface. It makes you think, doesn't it? How a man can grow old, pass through the years unnoticed, even respected, while living alongside the memory of something unforgivable. And how one day, time catches up. 45 years later, the knock on the door finally came. Now, let me explain. What strikes me here is not just the crime itself, but the way truth takes its time to resurface. 45 years. That's a whole lifetime. For all those years, the man who stole George Seitz's life grew old, ate, slept, probably laughed with his neighbors. And on the other side, his family lived in the shadow of silence, trapped in a void without answers. Justice sometimes moves like a shadow. You think it's gone, forgotten in some dusty archive drawer. But no, it waits, it lingers, and eventually it knocks. Science, persistence, small coincidences. All of them align one day, and what was once buried comes back to light. And I can't help but wonder, how do you live with that kind of absence? How do you fall asleep night after night, year after year, not knowing what happened? These are invisible wounds. They don't bleed, but they never heal. They change the way a family smiles. They weigh on every memory, every gathering. What haunts me most is this: nothing ever truly disappears. The past, no matter how dark, no matter how deeply hidden, always finds its way back. Sometimes through memories, sometimes through science, sometimes with the brutal shock of a late arrest. And maybe that's the only certainty we get from this story. You can outrun time, but you can't erase it.